The restaurant smelled like rosemary and candle wax, and Marlo Ainsley had rehearsed her opening line 4 times in the car. Before she even got out, her friend Delphine had set this up. A coworker's cousin, a guy named Sullivan Cade who sounded perfect on paper, whatever that meant. Marlo wasn't big on blind dates. She'd said yes anyway, because it had been 2 years since her last relationship ended, and because Delphine had that particular tone of voice that made refusing feel like giving up on herself. So she wore the green dress she liked, the one that made her feel like she still had some shape to her life, and she walked into Ember and Oak, with her shoulders back and something close to hope sitting in her chest. Sullivan was already at the table, tall, dark-haired, wearing a blazer that fit like it had been chosen with care. He stood when she approached. That was something, at least, and for 1 second his eyes met hers and she thought, okay, maybe this won't be terrible. Then something shifted in his face. It was fast, almost nothing, the kind of flicker most people would miss. But Marlo had spent her whole life reading rooms, reading faces, and she caught it. His smile went thin. His eyes moved once, quickly, down and back up, the way you'd glance at a price tag you didn't like. "I'm so sorry," he said, before she'd even sat down. "I just got a call, work emergency. I have to go." There was no phone in his hand. No message had buzzed. Marlo stood there in her green dress, holding her purse like a shield, and watched him drop 2 20s on the table and walk out the door, without looking back once. The hostess gave her a pitying glance. The couple at the next table pretended not to have noticed, which meant they'd noticed everything. Marlo sat down anyway, because she'd be damned if she was going to let a stranger's 10-second judgment chase her out of a restaurant she'd been looking forward to trying. She ordered a glass of wine. She drank it slowly, and somewhere underneath the humiliation, small, cold resolve began to form, not about Sullivan Cade, who she'd never see again, and didn't care to, but about herself. She'd been coasting. She could admit that now, sitting alone at a table meant for two. She'd been coasting at work, coasting in her friendships, coasting in the vague hope that things would simply arrange themselves into a life she liked. Nobody was going to arrange anything for her. She finished the wine, left a generous tip out of some strange defiant pride, and drove home with the windows down, even though it was cold, because she wanted to feel something other than shame. What? Marlo didn't know. What she wouldn't learn until much later was that Sullivan Cade hadn't left because of her dress or her weight or her face. He'd left because 3 days earlier, his fiancée of for years had packed 2 suitcases and moved out while he was at work, leaving a note on the counter instead of a conversation. He hadn't told anyone, not even the cousin who'd set up the date, because Sullivan Cade was the kind of man who built walls out of competence and pretended the walls were just how buildings worked. He'd shown up to the date because canceling felt like admitting something was wrong. And then, the moment he sat across from a real, hopeful, present woman, the wrongness had risen up in his throat like water, and he'd panicked. He didn't remember driving home that night. He only remembered sitting in his car outside his apartment for 40 minutes, unable to go up the stairs to the empty rooms waiting for him. None of that mattered to Marlo, because none of that was hers to know. What was hers was the aftermath, the slow, deliberate rebuilding of a life she'd let go slack. She'd been working as a mid-level graphic designer at a marketing firm, good enough to keep her job, never quite good enough to be noticed for anything more. 2 weeks after the date, that wasn't, she started staying late, not out of obligation, but out of something that felt, for the first time in years, like hunger. She redesigned her portfolio from scratch. She started taking on freelance work at night, small at first, a bakery's branding, a local nonprofit's website, and she poured into it a kind of care she hadn't given anything in a long time. Maybe not since art school, back when she still believed her hands could build things worth looking at. Delphine called to apologize about the date, mortified on Sullivan's behalf, even though she didn't know the real reason either. Marlo told her not to worry about it. She meant it. Something about that 10-second rejection had lit a fuse in her that she was almost grateful for. In the strange way people are, sometimes grateful for the things that hurt them into motion. By spring, her freelance client list had tripled. By summer, she'd left the marketing firm to go independent, working out of a sunlit studio apartment she'd started renting above a flower shop. The smell of lilies drifting up through the floorboards some mornings. She stopped, waiting for her life to arrange itself. She built it, piece by piece, the way she used to build things before she'd let herself forget how. Sullivan's year looked different, but it moved on its own kind of current. The weeks after the breakup had been brutal, in a quiet, private way, the kind of grief nobody sends flowers for because on paper nothing had died. Just a future he'd been planning around someone who no longer wanted to be in it. He went to therapy for the first time in his life, mostly because his sister threatened to stop taking his calls if he didn't. He learned, slowly and with real resistance, that the walls he built out of competence had also walled out anyone who might have helped him carry things. He learned to say, a struggling out loud, which had once felt to him like a foreign language. He thought about the blind date more than he expected to. Not because he remembered Marlowe's face in detail, but because he remembered the shame of what he'd done to a stranger who hadn't deserved it. He never got her number. He never found a way to apologize. It sat in him like an unfinished sentence. A year, almost to the week, after that night at Ember and Oak, Sullivan's company hired an outside design consultant to rebrand their client-facing materials for a major product launch. He wasn't in charge of the hire. That had gone through the marketing director, but he was in the room for the pitch meeting, half listening, scrolling through a presentation deck someone had already forwarded him. When the consultant walked in and his stomach dropped straight through the floor, Marlowe didn't recognize him at first. She was focused, professional, dressed in a sharp navy blazer over the same kind of confident, put-together look she'd cultivated over the past year without even meaning to. She'd simply started dressing like someone who took her own work seriously, and it turned out that person had always been in there. She set up her laptop, greeted the room with an easy, competent warmth, and began walking through her rebrand concept with the kind of clarity that came from actually believing in what you'd made. It was 3 full minutes before she got to the third slide, glanced up to gauge the room's reaction, and locked eyes with Sullivan Cade, sitting at the end of the table. She didn't flinch. That was the part he'd remember most later. She held his gaze for exactly 1 beat too long to be accidental, and then she went back to her presentation like nothing had happened, because nothing needed to happen. She had a pitch to finish and a life that no longer bent around the memory of a man who'd once decided she wasn't worth 10 more minutes of his time. Sullivan couldn't look away for the rest of the meeting, not out of the old, thin attraction he'd felt and abandoned a year earlier, but out of something heavier, dawning, uncomfortable recognition of exactly what he'd walked out on, and exactly who she'd become since. He watched her field a difficult question from the CFO with total composure. He watched her sketch a revised concept live on the whiteboard. When someone pushed back, turning skepticism into enthusiasm in under 2 minutes. He sat there, 31 years old, and understood with total clarity that he was watching a woman operate at the peak of her own becoming, and that he had been the small, forgettable footnote that helped put her there. He waited until the meeting broke up, and then he did something that took more nerve than he expected. He caught her by the elevators before she could leave. Marlowe. Her name came out rougher than he meant it to. I owe you an apology I should have given you a year ago. She turned to look at him, unhurried, unbothered in a way that made him feel smaller than any anger could have. You don't owe me anything, Sullivan. You made your choice. I made mine. I know. Well, I don't get to just say something now and have it matter. He shoved his hands in his pockets, and for the first time she saw something underneath the polish and unsteadiness. He wasn't bothering to hide. That night, I wasn't leaving because of you. My engagement had ended 3 days before. I didn't know how to sit across from someone and pretend I was fine, so I ran. It was never about you. I've thought about how that must have felt for a year, and I've hated myself for it. Marlowe studied him for a long moment. A year ago, this confession might have undone her. Now, I landed somewhere quiet. Not forgiveness exactly. Not yet. but something adjacent to it. That actually helps, she said finally. Not because I needed the excuse. Because I spent a long time wondering what was wrong with me. It's good to know the truth was never about that. There was nothing wrong with you, Sullivan said. And it came out with more force than either of them expected. There's nothing wrong with you. I think that's the whole problem, honestly. I noticed it that night, right before I panicked and ran. I've just spent a year noticing it from a distance. The elevator arrived. She didn't get on it. Neither did he. I'm not the same person who sat down at that table, Marlowe said. I built a life I actually like. I'm not looking to hand it over to someone just because he finally figured out what he lost. I'm not asking you to hand anything over, he said. I'm asking if I could take you to dinner. Not a blind date this time. Just two people who already know exactly what they're walking into. She almost said no. Some part of her wanted to, on principle. Wanted to let him carry the weight of that night a little longer. The way she'd carried it alone for months. But another part of her, the part that had learned, over the past year, to stop punishing herself for other people's fear, recognized that there was a difference between protecting herself and refusing to let anyone in at all. She'd done the work. She could afford to be curious. One dinner, she said, and if you get a fake emergency call halfway through, I'm keeping the wine list as a souvenir. For the first time in longer than he could remember, Sullivan laughed. A real one, surprised out of him. Fair enough. They had dinner 2 nights later, at a different restaurant, one with no history attached to it. He listened more than he talked, which she noticed and appreciated. He asked about her studio above the flower shop, about the client who'd made her cry with gratitude after a rebrand, saved their struggling nonprofit, about the version of her life she'd built out of the wreckage of one humiliating night. He didn't try to fix anything or explain anything away. He just showed up, fully, the way he hadn't known how to a year before. It took months before it turned into anything real, and Marlowe made sure of that pace. Herself, she wasn't interested in skipping the parts where trust actually gets built. But 11 months after that pitch meeting, on the same street, outside Ember and Oak, of all places, Sullivan stood in front of her under the same golden evening light, and told her that leaving that restaurant, a year and a half ago, was the worst decision he'd ever made, and staying in her life since was the best one. Marlowe, who no longer needed anyone's approval to know her own worth, smiled anyway, because some things, once earned honestly, are worth letting yourself feel. She never did get that wine list. She got something better, proof that the worst 10 seconds of her life had quietly become the beginning of the best years of it.